Picture this. It's September 11th, 1985. A quiet 62-year-old man with graying hair and weathered hands walks into the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service in Burbank, California. To anyone watching, he looks like thousands of other senior citizens going about their daily business in Reagan's America. But this man carried a secret so extraordinary, so unbelievable, that when he finally spoke the truth, it would send shockwaves through the nation and force America to rewrite the final chapter of World War II. His hands trembled, not from age, but from the crushing weight of 4 decades of deception as he approached the government clerk behind the Formica counter. "My name is Georg Gärtner," he said, his accented English softened and worn smooth by years of careful practice. "I am a German prisoner of war, and I have been hiding in America since 1945. The clerk looked up from her paperwork, a flicker of confusion in her eyes, certain she had misheard. World War II had ended 40 years ago. Every German prisoner had been shipped home decades earlier. The files were closed, the camps dismantled. The war, a fading black-and-white memory in the minds of most. Yet here stood a man claiming to be the last German soldier on American soil, a living ghost from a buried past. And what he was about to reveal would prove that truth is indeed stranger, more complex, and far more human than fiction. Stay with me, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about courage, identity, and what it truly means to choose your country. To understand Georg Gärtner's incredible decision, we must first travel back in time, back to the scorching, sun-bleached deserts of North Africa in 1943. The gears of war were grinding to a halt for Germany. Rommel's Afrika Korps, once the swaggering pride of the Wehrmacht, was in full, desperate retreat as Allied forces closed in from all sides like a tightening steel fist. Georg Peter Gärtner was just 21 years old, barely more than a boy, when he found himself trapped with his unit near Tunis. Like so many young Germans of his generation, he'd been swept into the war's vast, impersonal machinery before he was old enough to understand its true cost. The propaganda had promised glory, a quick victory, and a hero's welcome. Instead, he found himself thousands of miles from home, fighting a losing battle in an alien desert that felt like the surface of another planet, the air thick with the smell of cordite and hot metal. The end, when it came, was sudden and apocalyptic. Allied artillery pounded German positions for hours, a relentless symphony of destruction, before British and American forces overwhelmed what remained of their defenses. Gärtner, wounded by shrapnel and separated from his unit, crawled behind the smoldering hull of a destroyed Panzer tank and waited for death. Instead, he found capture. British soldiers, their uniforms caked in dust and their faces grim with war's exhaustion, found him semi-conscious among the wreckage. But instead of the bullet he expected, they gave him water from a canteen. Instead of a brutal interrogation, they provided medical care for his wounds. It was Gärtner's first glimpse of something that would shape the rest of his extraordinary life, the possibility that enemies could be human. Like hundreds of thousands of other German prisoners, Gärtner was loaded onto troop ships and transported across the vast, unforgiving Atlantic to America. The journey took weeks, sailing through U-boat-infested waters, past the very submarines that had once been commanded by his countrymen. The bitter irony was not lost on him. America in 1943 was a fortress of democracy, a colossus awakened. Its factories hummed with a 24-hour rhythm of wartime production, its citizens united behind a cause they believed was just. For Georg Gärtner, sailing into New York Harbor and seeing the colossal green form of the Statue of Liberty for the first time, it was like entering another world entirely. Gärtner's destination was Camp Deming, New Mexico, one of hundreds of prisoner of war camps scattered across the American landscape. The U.S. military was housing over 400,000 German prisoners by 1943, an unprecedented logistical feat. But these weren't the concentration camps or gulags that the prisoners might have expected from their own government's propaganda. Camp Deming, like most American POW facilities, operated under strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. Prisoners received 3 meals a day, proper medical care, recreational activities, and even work assignments that paid actual wages. For most of Gärtner's fellow prisoners, the camp represented an unexpected, almost surreal reprieve from the brutality of the front lines. They could play soccer, write letters home, even attend classes taught by American instructors. Some prisoners later said their time in American camps was the best period of their lives. But Georg Gärtner was different. While his comrades settled into the mundane rhythm of camp life, a rhythm of waiting, Gärtner spent his time studying, not English or American history, but escape routes. He watched the guards, memorized their routines, and cataloged every weakness in the camp's security. The high desert of New Mexico stretched endlessly beyond the barbed wire. Most prisoners saw only emptiness and death in that stark landscape. Gärtner saw possibility. He began preparing with the methodical, almost obsessive precision that had made German soldiers famous. He saved scraps of civilian clothing, traded from work details outside the camp. He hoarded small amounts of money earned from the camp's work programs, a total of $40 that would have to last indefinitely. Most importantly, he studied English with an intensity that surprised his fellow prisoners. He devoured any book or newspaper he could find, listening intently to the guards' conversations, mimicking their accents in secret. "Why do you work so hard to learn their language?" one prisoner asked him, bewildered. "We will all be going home soon." Gärtner's answer was prophetic. "Because I may need to speak it for a very long time." By the summer of 1945, with the war in Europe definitively over and the looming specter of repatriation, Gärtner knew his time was running out. He had no desire to return to a Germany that lay in smoldering ruins, occupied by foreign armies. The Nazis, the regime that had sent him to war as a teenager, held no claim on his loyalty. America, ironically, had treated him better as a prisoner than Germany had treated him as a citizen. The plan he devised was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. He would not just escape. He would disappear entirely, transforming himself from Georg Gärtner, German prisoner, into someone new. Someone American. September 10, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 4 months. Japan would surrender in just days. Most German prisoners were already being processed for repatriation, loaded onto ships that would carry them back to an uncertain future. Georg knew his turn was coming soon. It was now or never. The night of September 10th was a night like any other at Camp Dimming. Guards conducted their routine, monotonous patrols. The sweeping beams of searchlights sliced through the darkness, and prisoners settled into their barracks for what most assumed would be just another night of captivity. But Gärtner had been planning this moment for months. He had studied the guard rotations so thoroughly he could predict their movements to the minute. He knew exactly where the fence was weakest, where the shadows fell darkest, and when he would have the longest window of opportunity. At precisely 2:17 a.m., when the nearest guard post was between shifts and the main searchlight was focused on the opposite side of the camp, Gärtner put his plan into action. He slipped out of his barracks through a window he had carefully loosened over weeks. Moving like a phantom, he reached the perimeter fence where he had been slowly, patiently cutting wire strands with a small tool fashioned from a sharpened spoon handle. The New Mexico desert was brutally cold at night, a shocking contrast to the blazing heat of the day. Gärtner wore every piece of civilian clothing he had managed to acquire, layered against the chill, knowing that his prison uniform would mark him as an escapee to anyone who saw him. He crawled through the narrow gap in the fence. For the first time in over 2 years, Georg Gärtner was free. But freedom in the middle of the New Mexico desert was a relative and terrifying concept. He was hundreds of miles from any major city, with minimal supplies and a thick German accent that would immediately identify him as foreign. The smart, logical move would have been to head south toward Mexico, where border security was less stringent and a man could disappear more easily. Instead, Gärtner did something that would have shocked his captors. He walked north, deeper into America. The first 24 hours were the most dangerous of his life. When guards discovered his absence during morning roll call, they launched a massive manhunt. Bloodhounds were brought in, tracking his scent for miles before it was lost in the desert winds. Local sheriff's departments were alerted. The FBI joined the search. Radio broadcasts crackled to life, warning civilians to be on the lookout for a dangerous escaped prisoner. But Gärtner had vanished into the vastness of the American landscape like smoke in the wind. And what nobody realized, what nobody could have possibly guessed, was that the escaped prisoner had no intention of leaving the country. In a twist that would have been unthinkable to his pursuers, Georg Gärtner was not fleeing America. He was embracing it. Somewhere in the rugged mountains of Colorado, Georg Gärtner ceased to exist. In his place, Dennis F. Wiles was born. Using forged papers he had meticulously created with materials stolen from the prison camp and English skills he had developed through relentless, intensive study, Gärtner became Dennis Wiles, a drifter from the South whose personal records, he would claim, were lost in the chaos of wartime. His first job was washing dishes in a gritty Denver diner. The owner, a stern woman who'd lost her son in the Pacific, was impressed by Dennis's quiet diligence and incredible work ethic. "Lots of folks from the South talk funny," she told the other employees. "At least this one works hard." Gärtner threw himself into becoming Dennis with the same military precision he had once applied to his military duties. He studied American customs through movies, learned regional accents by listening to the radio for hours, and absorbed American history by reading discarded newspapers. But the most remarkable transformation was psychological. As months turned into years, Gärtner found himself genuinely caring about American current events, following baseball scores with real interest, and developing political opinions not as a foreigner, but as an American. By 1950, Georg Gärtner had become Dennis Wiles in ways that went deeper than false papers. He was thinking, dreaming, and feeling as an American. Then, something happened that completed his transformation. He fell in love. Her name was Mary, a waitress at a diner where Dennis now worked as a cook. She was independent, optimistic, and refreshingly direct. They began dating in 1951, and for the first time since his escape, Gärtner was truly happy. Mary knew Dennis as a quiet, hard-working man with a charming, vaguely European accent. She never questioned his vague explanations about his background, accepting his reluctance to talk about the past as evidence of a difficult childhood. For 3 years, Gärtner experienced American family life. He helped Mary's young daughter with her homework, taught her to ride a bicycle, and attended parent-teacher conferences with a swelling sense of pride. They celebrated Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the 4th of July with genuine enthusiasm. The relationship, however, ultimately ended not because of his secret but over ordinary incompatibilities. Mary wanted the security of marriage and more children. Dennis, knowing that any official scrutiny, any marriage license, could destroy everything, couldn't commit to the legal entanglements. When they parted amicably in 1954, Mary's final words haunted him. "You're a good man, Dennis. I just wish you weren't so afraid of settling down." If only she had known what he was really afraid of. For the next quarter century, Dennis Wiles lived one of the most extraordinary double lives in American history. He worked steadily, moving from job to job and state to state, always careful never to stay in one place long enough to attract unwanted attention, but long enough to establish the references and work history that would support his fragile, false identity. He was a ski instructor in Colorado, charming tourists from around the world with his mysterious European accent and his carefully edited stories of travels that were thinly veiled versions of his real experiences. Wealthy visitors tipped him generously and invited him to lavish parties in their mountain homes, never suspecting they were socializing with a fugitive from one of America's most intensive manhunts. He repaired televisions in California during the golden age of that industry, his precise German engineering training serving him well in the emerging world of electronics. Customers praised Dennis Wiles for his meticulous work and honest prices. Some became friends, inviting him to backyard barbecues and family gatherings where he played the role of the friendly bachelor neighbor to perfection. He tended gardens for wealthy families in Nevada, finding a quiet peace in nurturing growing things after a youth spent in destruction. His employers trusted him with the keys to their homes, with their children, with their most valuable possessions. They had no idea they were entrusting their security to a man who was technically still an enemy combatant from a war most people preferred to forget. Throughout it all, Dennis Wiles was liked and respected by his fellow Americans. He was the kind of neighbor who would lend you tools, help you move furniture, or watch your house while you were on vacation. He paid his taxes faithfully, never missed a day of work unless he was genuinely ill, and had never been arrested for anything more serious than a minor traffic violation. But the secret aided him like a slow-acting acid. Every 4th of July fireworks display felt like a betrayal, but a betrayal to which country? Every time he stood for the Pledge of Allegiance at a public event, he wondered if he was committing treason. But treason to whom? To Germany, which had conscripted him as a teenager to fight a war he never believed in. Or to America, which had treated him better as a prisoner than his homeland had treated him as a citizen. The paranoia was a constant, low-level hum in the background of his life. When police officers pulled him over for minor traffic violations, his heart would race, but his carefully maintained papers always passed inspection. The FBI manhunt for Georg Gärtner had long since gone cold, filed away in a dusty cabinet as just another unsolved case from a war that was rapidly becoming ancient history. By the 1970s, Gärtner had been free for longer than he had ever been a prisoner. America had changed dramatically around him. The civil rights movement, Vietnam, Watergate, the counterculture, and he had experienced it all as an insider, not as a foreign observer. He had watched the moon landing with tears of genuine pride in his eyes. He had mourned the assassination of President Kennedy as deeply as any native-born American. He had lived through every triumph and tragedy of the American experience for 3 decades. In his heart, he was more American than many Americans. The problem was that none of it was legally real. By the early 1980s, Georg Gärtner was entering his 60s. His German accent had all but faded, and his native German had grown rusty from disuse. Sometimes he even struggled to remember German words, while English came to him with an effortless, natural fluency. Then, in 1983, something happened that sent him into weeks of cold panic. He stumbled upon a magazine article about World War II POWs. A small paragraph mentioned, Georg Gärtner, escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico in 1945, is still at large. Reading his real name in print was like seeing a ghost. The past he had worked so desperately to escape was still following him, a shadow he could never outrun. He began to obsess over one terrifying question: what would happen if he finally told the truth? The America of 1985 was not the America of 1945. The Cold War had made the Soviets the enemy, not the Germans. West Germany was a trusted NATO ally. The idea that one elderly man who had lived a peaceful, productive life for 4 decades would be treated as a dangerous enemy seemed absurd. But what finally tipped the balance wasn't a fear of discovery, but something far more profound: the simple human desire to die as himself. At 62, Georg Gärtner wanted to spend his remaining years as who he really was, not who he had pretended to be. On the morning of September 11, 1985, Georg Gärtner woke up in his modest California apartment and made the most incredible decision of his extraordinary life. He was going to surrender, not because he had been discovered, not because he was dying, but because after 4 decades as Dennis Wiles, he wanted to reclaim his remaining years as Georg Gärtner. The walk to the immigration office felt endless. Every step brought a flood of memories. Crawling through the cold wire of the fence, a free man in a hostile desert, the taste of his first American meal, Mary's laughter echoing in a small diner, the flicker of the television as he watched the moon landing. Decades of close calls, of carefully constructed lies, of constant, gnawing fear. At the entrance to the federal building, he paused. This was his last chance to turn back, to melt back into the crowd, and continue the lie that had, in many ways, become his truth. Once he spoke those rehearsed words, there would be no going back. Georg Gärtner walked through those glass doors. My name is Georg Gärtner. I am a German prisoner of war, and I have been hiding in America since 1945. The words hung in the sterile office air, a confession that had the power to reshape a small corner of history. America's reaction to Georg Gärtner's voluntary surrender was unlike anything anyone expected, least of all Gärtner himself. Instead of outrage or calls for punishment, the response was overwhelmingly sympathetic. Within hours, the story had leaked to the press, and by that evening, Georg Gärtner was the lead story on every major news network. But he wasn't portrayed as a dangerous fugitive. Instead, he was a human interest story, an old man whose incredible journey from enemy soldier to productive American citizen challenged every assumption about loyalty and identity. Editorial writers called him the most honest man in America. Veterans groups, instead of being angry, expressed admiration for the courage it took to surrender. Talk shows competed for interviews, treating him more like a celebrity than a criminal. Federal prosecutors, faced with this unique case, found that while Gärtner had technically committed crimes, escape, immigration violations, identity fraud, he had committed no other crimes during his 40 years of freedom. Given his age, his voluntary surrender, and his exemplary behavior as Dennis Wiles, they recommended only minimal punishment. The American public began to see Gärtner not as an enemy combatant who had evaded justice, but as an unlikely American success story. Here was a man who had chosen America, even when that choice required him to live as a criminal. He had paid taxes, held jobs, and contributed to society for 4 decades. Letters of support poured in from across the country. Americans offered him jobs, places to stay, and even money. Marriage proposals arrived from women charmed by his romantic, almost mythical story of transformation. Georg spent only a few months in a minimum security detention facility, while officials decided what to do with this unprecedented case. He received thousands of supportive letters from ordinary Americans. Hollywood producers offered to buy the rights to his story. Publishers competed for his memoirs. Television networks wanted exclusive interviews. But Gärtner handled his newfound fame with a quiet, humble dignity, giving only a few carefully chosen interviews in which he emphasized his gratitude to America and his regret for his decades of deception. In early 1986, immigration officials made a surprising and compassionate decision. Georg Gärtner was granted permission to remain in the United States as a legal resident, with a clear path to full citizenship. At 63, after 40 years of living as a criminal, Georg Gärtner was finally free, not just from prison bars, but from the prison of deception he had built around himself. The irony was profound. America's most wanted escaped prisoner of war became America's most celebrated voluntary surrender. After his release, Georg Gärtner lived quietly, working as a maintenance man and declining most interviews. The man who had lived for 40 years under a false identity now preferred anonymity under his real name. He never married. He never returned to Germany. America, he said, had been his home for longer than Germany ever was. Georg Gärtner died peacefully in 2013 at the age of 90 in a California veterans hospital, receiving full military honors, not as a German soldier, but as a man who had served his adopted country by choosing to live productively within it for over 60 years. Georg Gärtner's story challenges every assumption we have about loyalty, identity, and redemption. He was an enemy soldier who became more American than many Americans. A criminal whose only crime was wanting to be free. His voluntary surrender remains one of the most extraordinary acts of moral courage in American immigration history. He gave up a guaranteed freedom to gain something far more valuable, the right to live and die as his authentic self. Sometimes, the most incredible thing a person can do is tell the truth, even when it takes 40 years to find the courage. And sometimes, the truth really can set you free.
Dear viewers, thank you for being here. Stay tuned to the channel for tons of exciting videos. Every day we upload fresh stories packed with thrills, suspense, and surprises. Don't miss out. Comment, share, subscribe, and hit that like button. This channel is for you, and the best is yet to come.